Hello and welcome to the Three Will Podcast. This is your host, Danny Ryan, and today I have Mr. Tim Coalson here with me, the famous or infamous Tim Coalson here with me. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Danny. I think infamous is probably most appropriate. So,
well, we for this podcast, what we're going to do is we're going to follow up with one that we did yesterday with Matthew, since you're working with Matthew. Yes.
Yep, working with Matthew.
Awesome. In fact, we brought that up yesterday during the podcast, which I'm sure you've listened to, right, Tim?
What podcast?
It was a podcast about the project that you and Matthew are in and on right now, and we actually brought you up in the end, and we had some nice things to say about you. Can you believe that?
It's hard to believe, but I will have to say that my customers apparently listened to that podcast and brought it up on one of our calls today. So,
well, we didn't say anything negative about you, Tim, because you, for some reason, I guess it's just your great personality. You tend to take the jokes really well and put out the jokes really well around the office. Sure.
Yeah. All right.
Awkward silence. Quiet. Yes. Okay. So today our topic, since Matthew already sort of stole the thunder with what's going on the project that you guys are working on, I guess sort of to follow up with him, just for folks who may have not heard that specific episode. It's on a public-facing site. Is that correct?
That's right. A support site for tax and accounting software.
Excellent. And so we typically use a lot of our projects are using SharePoint for intranets, extranets, and then with this public-facing site, this was, and we pointed this out with Matthew as well, is that we're using ASP.NET for this site for the web technology, correct?
Right. In this case, it's actually a site that's been out there a while. We were brought in primarily to do a rebranding of the site. But over time, we're starting to expand the site to leverage some more current, I guess, back-end systems. For example, now we're changing the site, and y'all probably talked about this yesterday, to integrate with Salesforce on the back end for case content as well as knowledge-based content. So we're moving from integration with some homegrown systems that had been developed in-house to now using more some standard systems like Salesforce.
The question I wanted to get to in this episode was, since you've been our sort of go-to SharePoint front-end guy for quite a while, and I know you're not into the graphic design, but more into implementing it on SharePoint. But I wanted to get sort of your thoughts on the differences between using ASP.NET versus using SharePoint on projects. And it doesn't have to be an expansive list, just some initial thoughts, and it could be pros or cons about using ASP.NET versus SharePoint.
Yeah, it's interesting with SharePoint, especially in large corporations, or maybe even not even large, but corporations that already have a SharePoint presence, as SharePoint as a corporate asset. One of the things about working on projects, usually we're brought in by the business. So we can really focus on the business problems, coming up with a good business solution. And with a SharePoint infrastructure already in place, we really don't have to worry about a lot of the logistics that we do in non-SharePoint projects. For example, acquiring IIS front-end web servers, worrying about a database backend. With a SharePoint infrastructure already in place, a lot of the logistics, a lot of the networking things that have to be thought about for a non-SharePoint site, a lot of those have already been taken care of by the time we come in, because there's already a SharePoint infrastructure in place. So then really our time and energy is spent really on providing a customer solution. So working with the customers, understanding what the problem is, coming up with the appropriate list and other SharePoint configurations, workflows to help solve that problem. So with ASP.NET, of course, the advantage to that is you're really not constrained by some of the constraints that SharePoint would put on you. So SharePoint, especially Office 365, some of the customizations, they generally don't want you doing a lot of heavy customization of the UI because, Office 365 is an ever-evolving platform. They're continuing to roll out new features, so they don't really always guarantee from one day to the next that everything's going to be the same. So with ASP.NET, for example, you're in full control of everything that you do. Therefore, you can come up with a more creative UI, use some of the more modern JavaScript libraries to integrate. Even though you can use those with SharePoint, you're really not constrained by using a cloud platform that you don't control. So you have a lot more creativity that you can bring to the table. So
nice. And so it sounds like, what I'm hearing you say is with SharePoint, we end up being able to focus more on the business problem or with the solution that we're trying to create, as opposed to, I think with it sounds like with something where you're sort of starting from the ground up with ASP.NET, you're having to put a lot of that infrastructure that's typically already in place for the project.
Right, and in some cases, some of these companies already have that infrastructure in place, so you're really possibly building on existing platform IaaS web servers, SQL Server databases. So in some cases, a lot of that infrastructure may already be in place, even for an ASP.NET solution. So it really kind of depends on where they're at. If you're going to reuse existing infrastructure, then you don't have to spend so much time and energy on that. But
and we talked, Matthew and I talked about. The process doesn't change here. We're still using Scrum. We're still doing sprints. Anything from your standpoint as far as the user interface, as far as mocking things up and things like that, or are you working with their graphics department, or how are you working together with someone to produce out the screens?
Our initial work was a rebranding, which we've rolled out that rebranding to production. Now we've kind of moved on from that to an integration. But in the original rebranding, we did bring in our graphic designer, one that we work with a lot, who has a lot of great experience building a lot of public sites. So we came up with a lot of concepts. We looked around at some of the leading sites, your Apple, your Google.coms, and tried LinkedIn as well, to try to leverage what are some of the more common, metaphors that are being used on websites for, notifications, for example, breaking news on CNN. So we wanted to leverage that type of concept on our site so that, when there was something important that we wanted to communicate to users, that we would have that banner across the top that would, in red, that would get their attention, but we would also allow them to be able to acknowledge that notification, and then they would reclaim that real estate in the UI. So we leveraged a designer to help us go through it. So we created various screen mocks and ran those by our customers, got feedback, made modifications, and then also in this case, we had to work against corporate standards that had already been defined. So they actually had a branding website that had a lot of details, color palettes, and even more detailed design specifications that we had to adhere to. So in this case, it was bringing both our creativity, but also leveraging their corporate branding assets.
Mm-hmm. What's been the big difference from moving where you've been doing more of a front-end rebranding to more of an integration, a complex integration on the back end? What's been the primary difference? Has it been just more communication, or is it less communication? What's sort of the differences that you see as you move into more of integration type work?
Yeah, it's really involved a lot of communication. So there's 3 teams. There's the support site team, then we have a enterprise service bus team, so they're developing the services that we consume, and then of course on the back end there's actually a group writing code, Apex code in Salesforce to actually read and write data into Salesforce itself. So really trying to make sure from an interface perspective that we're all in agreement as to here's what the interface is, and then as changes are made in each of the different levels, making sure that we're all in sync in terms of the timing of those, so that all of a sudden things don't quit working. So really just a lot of communications that's necessary, and then even beyond the interface itself, coming to a common understanding about what, from a business perspective, what is their requirements on the back end, and making sure that flows all the way through. So for example, today we were talking about dates. So Salesforce stores dates in a UTC format. So part of our discussion was, okay, how do we want to deal with those dates on the front end website? Do we want to convert to some common UTC, some common date that would be an offset of the UTC, or do we want to have more of a localized date, so that based on each user's location, we would show that date for that person? So things like that have been part of that conversation.
Is there so you're focusing in on the integration, the site's live. I found that out from Matthew. What's the next couple of months look like for you?
So right now we're integrating with cases in Salesforce. Then we've got a second phase that will integrate with knowledge-based content. So our knowledge-based content will now come from Salesforce. Some of the next phases include some enhancements to the functionality today. So today there are certain payment options that a customer can go in, they can sign into the site, and they can set up different payment options. In the future, we're going to expand those options to include more options to pay credit card type payments, be able to do like monthly payments, things like that. So we're going to expand some of the user options to make it a more customer friendly site, to give them the most flexibility, and to allow them to be able to do that through an online, instead of having to make a call into a call center.
Nice. Well, we're over 10 minutes, Tim. Wasn't that quick? That was pretty painless, right?
Time flies.
So do you want to talk about how great the client is, or how great Matthew is, or who you want to talk about how great I am? How about that?
Oh yeah, obviously. No, we do have a good team. We do have a good customer. I mean, that certainly, I think when you are viewed as a partnership, where your customer trusts you, that you're going to make good decisions, and you trust your customer, it does make for a much better working relationship. We have fun on the project. So it's just a much better experience, and I think the customer gets more out of it. We get more out of it. So it's all around a good relationship.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for taking the time to do this, Tim.
All right, thank you.
And I'll see you in 3 months then.
It'll fly.
It will fly by. And thank you everybody for taking the time to listen. Please drop by 3will.com and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.